The stone stands on a flat plain in Östergötland, Sweden. It is gray and massive, over 2 meters tall. It has stood there since the early 800s. We call it the Roke runestone. It is covered in runes, nearly 760 of them, carved into 5 sides. They are small, precise, and deeply unnerving. A man named Varin carved them. He did it for his dead son Vamad. The inscription says so, but that is the only simple thing about it. Varin did not just write a memorial. He created a riddle, a monument of code. He used at least 2 different runic alphabets. He used ciphers. He wrote some parts in a way that forces you to read every second rune, then go back and read the ones you skipped. He wrote other parts using a code where each rune is replaced by another based on a secret pattern, and what he wrote is a fever dream of forgotten myths and cosmic questions. He mentions a hero, Theodoric the Great, but in a strange mythic way. He asks who, 9 generations ago, was born to a king. He talks about the sun. He talks about something terrible that will happen. For more than a century, scholars have argued about what Varin meant. Is it a lament for his son? A boast of his own knowledge? Is it a piece of magic meant to protect the world from a long, cold winter, like the one that followed a volcanic eruption a few hundred years before his time? We do not know. The Rockstone is not a message that is hard to read. It is a message that is hard to understand. It proves that the people who carved these marks were not just writing their ABCs, they were encoding the universe. You know, they were building things with letters. You know, runes were more than an alphabet. You know, they were a technology for interacting with the world, seen and unseen. They held secrets. Number 20A rune's name was its power. His name was Leif, and it was the year 780. He was not a warrior. He was a farmer on the coast of Norway, near where Kaupang would one day grow into a bustling town. His world was made of wood, wool, and the smell of salt and fish. He had 5 cows. 5 was not enough. 1 was old, 1 had given no calf, his family was hungry, words were a luxury, but marks were a necessity. His grandfather, a man named Hrolf, had taught him the marks. Not all of them, just a few. Rolf did not teach him to write letters. He taught him to call things. He took a piece of birch bark. He took his small knife, the one he used for everything from cutting bread to mending nets. He carved a mark. It looked a bit like an F, with its 2 arms pointing up to the right. "This is Noff," Rolf had said, his voice raspy like dry leaves. "This is Fihu." Leif, then just a boy of 10, did not understand. "What is Fihu?" "It is cattle," Rolf said. "It is wealth, not the sound. It is the thing. When you carve this, you are not writing. You are thinking of cattle. You are asking for cattle. You are putting the idea of cattle into the wood." He made Leif carve it over and over, feel the shape, say the name, Fahu. The name itself felt like a lowing cow. It was a word of substance. This was the first secret Leif learned. A rune was not a picture of a sound. A rune was a container for a concept. Its name was its meaning, and its meaning was its power. Rolf then carved another, a U-shape. Uriz, he grunted. The Aurochs, the wild ox. Strength, the power in the beast that you cannot tame. You carve Fehu because you want wealth. You carve Uruz when you need the strength to get it. And another, a sharp, pointed shape like a thorn. Thurisaz, the giant, the thorn in your side. Danger. But also protection from danger. You carve this on your door to keep trouble out. Leif spent years understanding this. He saw his neighbors scratch Fehu onto the posts of their cowsheds. He saw a trader carve a different rune, Rado, the rune for a journey, onto the prow of his new boat before setting sail. The rune was not a label, it was a request. It was an instruction given to the world. It was a way of focusing one's will. Now, as a man with hungry children, Leif remembered Hrolf's lesson. He did not need to write a long sentence asking the gods for help. The gods were busy. The world was busy. He needed to be specific. He needed a tool. He walked to his small, struggling cowshed. The wood was old and gray, worn smooth by the sea wind. He took out his own knife, the one his father had given him. It was not a magic knife, it was just a tool. He found a spot on the main support beam right above the door where the animals came in and out, and he just did not just scratch the mark. He thought about his grandfather's words. He focused his mind. He thought of his cows, of milk, of cheese, of leather. He thought of the security that more cattle would bring. He pictured a new calf, strong and healthy. Then he began to carve. He carved Fihu. As his knife cut into the wood, he whispered the name, Fihu. It was not a prayer in the way a Christian might pray. It was a statement of intent, a calling. He was aligning his need with the power contained in the rune's name. The name was the key. Without the name, it was just a meaningless scratch. With the name, it was an act. He did not know if it would work. That was not the point. The point was that this was the technology he had. It was how he could take his worry and his hope and make it solid. He could put it into the wood. The secret was simple. The rune for cattle did not just represent the word, it participated in the reality of cattle. Its name was its function. On number 19, the gods didn't give runes, they were taken. Odin did not receive the runes as a gift. He stole them. He took them through pain. This was a story Ingrid heard from her grandmother, a Volva, a Cirrus, whose eyes seemed to look past you rather than at you. It was the late 9th century, and they lived in a long house near the Great Lake Mälaren in Sweden. Christianity was a whisper from the south, a strange tale of a gentle god. Ingrid's world was older, and its gods were not gentle. Her grandmother Astrid did not speak of a benevolent god handing down commandments on a mountain. She spoke of a desperate god paying a terrible price for knowledge. He hung there for 9 nights, Astrid would say, her fingers twisting a thread of wool. On the great tree, Drasil, the wind whipped him. He was wounded by his own spear, a sacrifice of himself to himself. Ingrid, a young girl then, imagined the Allfather, a grim figure hanging in the endless dark, bleeding onto the roots of the world. Why? She asked. For wisdom, Astrid answered. The world does not give its secrets for free. You must pay. Odin paid with his eye for a drink from the well of Mimir to gain wisdom, but the runes, they were deeper. They were the secrets of creation itself. They were not in the well, they were in the pain. They were in the space between life and death. Astrid explained that on that 9th night, as he was close to death, Odin looked down, and there in the chaos of the roots, in the patterns of his own suffering, he saw them. The shapes, the staves, he did not understand them at first. He had to scream, he had to reach out and pull them up from the abyss. He took them. He seized them. This story shaped how Ingrid, and people like her, viewed the runes. They were not a divine gift to make life easy. They were a dangerous tool acquired through an ordeal. They were primal, raw power born of sacrifice. This meant using them was not a casual act. It was tapping into something that had cost the highest price. Years later, Ingrid was no longer a girl. She was a woman, known for her skill in healing. A boy in the village, Eric, had fallen from a roof. His arm was broken, the bone sticking out at a terrible angle. The village healer had set it, but a fever had taken hold. The arm was hot and swollen. People whispered of rot, of amputation, of death. Eric's mother came to Ingrid, her face a mask of terror. For Ingrid knew what she had to do. This was not a task for herbs alone. The body was failing. She needed to speak to the spirit of the boy, to the force of life within him. She needed the runes. She did not pray for a miracle. She prepared for an ordeal. She fasted for a day, just as Odin had starved on the tree. She took a small, sharp knife and went to the woods. She found a birch tree, a tree of life and new beginnings. She stripped a piece of bark. Back in her hut, she lit a single tallow lamp. The air grew thick and still. She did not carve a happy rune. She carved Uruz, the rune of the wild ox, for primal strength. She carved Sowilo, the sun, for life-giving energy. But first she had to pay. She took the knife and made a small clean cut on her own left thumb. She squeezed a drop of her own blood onto her finger and smeared it into the grooves of the runes she had carved on the bark. It was a tiny echo of Odin's great sacrifice. A price. A drop of her life to call upon the forces of life. She then went to Eric's bedside. She did not touch him. She held the birch bark and began to chant, a low, humming sound. The Guldur. She sang the names of the runes. She sang of the wild ox's strength flowing into the boy's weak limbs. She sang of the sun's warmth driving out the fever's cold. She was not asking. She was commanding. She was using the tool Odin had taken, and she was honoring the price he paid by paying a small one of her own. The runes were not a gift from a loving father. They were a secret wrested from the universe by a desperate seeker. To use them, you had to be willing to bleed a little too. Number 18, carving, was a ritual, not just writing. The year is 965. In Denmark, King Harald Bluetooth is busy building. He is building a kingdom, and he is building monuments to it. The greatest of these will be the Gelling Stone, a massive three-sided declaration of his power. The man tasked with carving the most intricate parts of the stone is not just a stonemason. His name is Asmund, and he considers himself a rune master, an Arelaz. For him, the act of carving, or risting, is a sacred ritual. He did not just show up in the morning with his hammer and chisels and start chipping away. The process began weeks before he ever touched the stone. He spent time observing the granite boulder. He walked around it at sunrise, at noon, at sunset. He watched how the light played on its surfaces. He laid his hands on it, feeling its cold, ancient texture. He was not just looking at his canvas, he was listening to it. The night before the main carving began, Asmund did not feast with the other workers. He went to a quiet place by a stream. He washed his tools, not just to clean them, but to purify them. His chisels were sharp, forged by the best smith. His hammer was made of seasoned oak. These were extensions of his will. He laid them on a clean cloth and meditated. He cleared his mind of chatter, of worries about pay, of arguments with his wife. He had to be an empty vessel for the runes to flow through. The act of carving itself was a kind of trance. He had the words from the king. King Haraldr ordered this monument made in memory of Gormr, his father, and in memory of Thurv, his mother, that Haraldr who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. But he was not just copying letters. For each rune, he entered a specific state of mind. When he carved the K rune, Kanaz, he thought of a torch, of knowledge, of the new Christian light Harold was bringing. His hammer blows were precise, sharp. When he carved the M rune, Manes, he thought of Man, of the Danish people Harold now ruled. His carving was steady, solid. The physical act was demanding. Dust filled the air. His shoulders ached. But the concentration was total. It was a collaboration between his mind, his body, the tools, and the stone. He chanted as he worked. Not loud, but a low murmur that followed the rhythm of his hammer. Kinaz, Onsus, Raidho. He was breathing the names of the runes into the stone as he gave them form. One of his apprentices, a young man named Finn, once asked him why he took so long. It's just letters, master. Why not carve them faster? Asmund stopped his work. He wiped sweat from his brow with a dusty forearm. He looked at Finn. "You see letters," he said. "I am building a house. Each rune is a timber. If you cut the timber with a distracted mind, it will be weak. The house will fall. This stone must stand for 1,000 years. The intent I put into this groove, right now, becomes part of its strength." He believed that his focus, his ritual preparation, his very intent, was physically imparted into the stone. The runes were not just marks on the stone, they were a new quality of the stone. The carving was not decoration. It was an enchantment. It was the process of turning dumb rock into a speaking, powerful object. This was the secret of risting. It was not writing. It was a magical and psychological act where the carver's state of being was a crucial ingredient. A rune carved in anger would carry anger. A rune carved with focus and purpose would carry that focus and purpose for centuries. And Asmund was not just making a monument. He was performing a ceremony in slow motion, a ritual that took months to complete, a prayer said with a hammer and chisel. Number 17 red paint was more than decoration. Solveig stood before the newly raised stone. It was tall and slender, a finger of granite pointing to the gray sky. The year was 1015, and this part of upland Sweden was a landscape of farms and memorial stones. This stone was for her husband Bjorn, who had gone east to Gardariki and not returned. News had come back of a fever in a swamp near the great rivers. He was gone. The rune master, a traveling carver named Ulf, had finished his work. The runes snaked up the stone in the belly of a carved serpent. They told the story Solveig raised this stone for Bjorn, her good husband. He died in the east. May God help his soul. The new Christian faith was blending with the old ways. Ulf had been paid his silver. His job was done. But the stone was not finished. It was not yet alive. That was Solveig's job. She held a small wooden bowl. Inside was a thick, dark red paste. It was not paint bought from a market. She had made it herself. The main ingredient was red ochre, a type of iron-rich earth she had ground for hours with a smooth stone. It was the color of rust, the color of dried blood. To this, she had mixed a binder, the yolk of an egg from her own hens, to make it stick to the stone. This was the final, crucial step. Activating the runes, bringing them to life. The color was not for looks. It was for power. Red was the color of blood. Blood was life. By filling the runes with this color, she was giving them life. Or she was feeding them. She dipped her finger into the paste. It was cool and gritty. She started at the bottom of the serpent's tail. Carefully, she traced the groove of the first rune, Fihu, for the wealth Bjorn had sought. As her finger moved, she whispered his name, Bjorn. She was not just coloring in the lines. She was pouring her grief, her memory, her love for him into the very stone. The act was slow and deliberate. Each rune was a separate moment. When she traced Rido, the rune of travel, she remembered the day he left, his boat small on the wide water. When she traced Ihwaz, the rune of death and the yew tree, tears fell from her eyes and mixed with the red paste on her finger. She was not just painting. She was performing the last rites. A neighbor, a practical woman named Gudrun, came to watch. "It's a fine stone, Solveig," she said. "The red will make it easy to read from the path." Solveig shook her head without looking up from her work. "It is not for reading," she said, her voice low. "It is for speaking. The red gives it a voice." This was the secret. The carving gave the runes form, the coloring gave them power. Some rune masters in older, darker times would have used real blood. Their own, or perhaps that of a sacrificed animal, that was the most potent activator. It was a direct transfer of life force. Solveig's red ochre was a substitute, a symbol, but it carried the same intent. It connected the stone to the living world, to the blood that had flowed in her husband's veins. When she was finished, the stone was transformed. The runes were no longer pale scratches in gray stone. They were vibrant, crimson channels of energy. They blazed against the granite. The serpent seemed to writhe. The stone now had a voice. It would speak of Bjorn to anyone who passed, not just with words, but with the very color of life itself. It was now complete. It was awake. Number 16, they didn't write on paper. And Hakon was a traitor. It was the year 1150, and he was in Bergen, on the coast of Norway. The city was a mess of wooden buildings, docks, and the constant smell of fish, tar, and wet wool. Hakon did not deal in big sagas or memorials for kings. He dealt in barrels of herring, bolts of cloth from England, and sharpening stones from the inland quarries. His world was practical, immediate, and required a lot of notes. Paper was a thing he had heard of, a rare, impossibly expensive material from the south. For Hakon and for everyone he knew, writing was done on what was available, and what was available was wood and bone. This morning he was arguing with a fisherman named Magnus about a shipment of cod. Magnus claimed he had delivered 20 barrels. Hakon's count was 19. An argument in the crowded marketplace could easily turn into a brawl, but Hakon was prepared. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small, flat piece of wood. It was smooth, about the size of his hand. It was a runic stick, runic kefli. On it, he had carved a message a week earlier. It was not a grand poem. It was a business note. Using the sharp tip of his knife, he had scratched into the pine, Magnus to deliver 20 barrels cod by Tuesday. Paid 5 silver for 10 up front. The runes were younger Futhark, quick and easy to carve. They were not perfect. They were hurried, functional. Look, Hakon said, holding the stick out to Magnus. Your name. 20 barrels. Tuesday, 5 silver. Magnus, a big man with a red beard, squinted at the stick. He could read runes, as most people could to some degree. He traced the scratches with a calloused finger. He grumbled. He could not argue with what was written. And it was there, in the wood. A contract. The argument was over. The wood did not forget. This was the reality of runic writing for most people. It was not on giant stones, it was on everyday objects. The material mattered. Writing on wood was different from writing on stone. It was temporary. A stick like Hakon's might be used for a message and then tossed into the fire once the deal was done. Archaeologists in Bergen would later find hundreds of these sticks preserved in the wet mud of the wharf. They contained shopping lists. Buy more salt. They held love notes. Gaida says, you are to come home. They were used for insults. Ingeborg has a new lover, and he is not you. They were the text messages and post-it notes of the Viking Age. Cone also had a set of bone tags. When he sent a shipment of goods, he would carve a rune onto a piece of sheep bone and tie it to the crate. He would give a matching bone tag to the captain of the ship. When the goods arrived, the recipient would match the tags to ensure it was the right shipment. It was a simple, effective security system. The material shaped the message. You could not write a long philosophical text on a fishbone. The medium demanded brevity. This is why so many runic inscriptions are short, and to the point Eric owns this comb. Though for carved these runes, the secret was that runes were a blue-collar technology. While rune masters carved majestic stones, ordinary people used them for the mundane business of life. They wrote on the femur of a cow, the rib of a pig, a splinter of wood from the fire pile. The runes were not just for eternity. They were for Tuesday, and the material they were carved on, humble, disposable, and everywhere, is what made them a part of everyone's world. Number 15, runes could lie. The 3 stones stood on a hill in Viking, Sweden. They had been there since the 7th century, long before the Viking Age proper. They were ancient even to the people of the 9th century. One stone was taller than the others. It was covered in stark, powerful Elder Futhark runes. This was the Björktorp runestone, and it held a terrible message. It was not a memorial, it was a threat. A young farmer named Stig lived in the shadow of these stones. He had grown up with them. His father had told him to never go near them after dark. His father said they were cursed. Stig was a practical man, but even he felt a coldness when he looked at the tall stone. The runes on it read, I, master of the runes, conceal here runes of power. Incessantly plagued by maleficence, doomed to insidious death, is he who breaks this. Another part of the inscription, on the other side, was even more direct. It contained a prophecy of doom, ending with the word Walad, which meant something like crafty death or death by sorcery. One day, a wealthy landowner from another region announced he had bought the land the stone stood on. He planned to clear the hill and plant barley. He dismissed the local stories as peasant superstition. They are just old rocks, he said, laughing. Stig and the other villagers were terrified. They pleaded with the landowner. They told him about the curse. They explained that the stones were not just rocks, they were a boundary marker, a magical fence. The curse was not just a story, it was a weapon. The landowner ignored them. He hired men to pull the stones down. This is where the secret of the lying runes comes in. The curse on the Björktorp stone was a piece of psychological warfare. Did the runes themselves have the power to kill a man with insidious death? Maybe, maybe not, but that was not the point. The point was to make people believe they did. The rune master who carved that stone, some unknown figure from the migration period, was using runes as a tool of power and control. He was essentially writing This land is mine. If you try to take it, a terrible magic will kill you. It was a lie in the sense that its power was not necessarily in the supernatural, but in the psychological. It was a threat so terrible that for hundreds of years it worked. The fear it generated was real. The landowner's men arrived with oxen and ropes. They were nervous. They had heard the stories. The first day, a rope snapped, an ox stumbled, and broke its leg. The men looked at each other, their faces pale. The next day, the landowner's chief worker fell sick with a sudden, violent fever. The coincidence? Bad luck? To the workers and the villagers, it was the curse. The runes were working. The fear became panic. The workers refused to go near the hill. The landowner, furious but now unnerved, eventually gave up. He left the stones alone. The runes had not needed to cast a magic spell. They had lied, or rather they had made a statement so powerful and so terrifying that it became true through the actions of fearful people. The curse worked because people believed in it. The runes were a vehicle for a very powerful idea, a meme of terror that protected the land for generations. Stig watched the landowner and his men leave. He looked up at the tall, grim stone. The runes were not just letters. They were not just a memorial. They were a weapon. They were a legal notice backed by a supernatural threat. And whether the threat was real or a brilliantly crafted lie, the result was the same. The stones remained. Number 14, you couldn't just learn them from a book. It was the dawn of the 10th century. In a small settlement near the coast of Jutland, a boy named Carl wanted to learn the runes. He was fascinated by them. He saw them on the memorial stone for the old chieftain, on the hilt of his father's sword, on the amulet his mother wore. They were marks of power. He wanted that power. He thought it would be simple. He could just copy the shapes. He found a piece of charcoal and started scratching the runes from the chieftain's stone onto a flat piece of wood. He copied the S rune, Sowilo, the T rune, Tiwaz. He thought he was writing. An old man named Einar saw him. See, Einar was missing an eye, and his left hand was a mass of scar tissue from a shipboard fire years ago. He was known as an Erlaz, a rune master, though he rarely carved anymore. He walked over to Carl. "What are you doing, boy?" Einar asked, his one eye sharp. "I am learning the runes," Carl said proudly, showing Einar his wood plank with its clumsy black shapes. Einar took the plank. He looked at it, then spat on the ground. "No," he said. "You are making dead shapes. A child drawing a picture of a wolf does not make a wolf. You have the body, but no spirit." Sir Carl was confused. "But they are the right shapes." "The shape is the last thing you learn," Einar said. Not the first. You cannot learn the runes from a stone any more than you can learn to be a warrior by looking at a sword. You have to be taught." This was the secret. Runic knowledge was not academic. It was a craft, a tradition passed down from master to apprentice. There were no books, no schools. There was only observation, imitation, and oral teaching. Einar agreed to teach Carl, but not in the way Carl expected. The first lesson did not involve a knife or a stone. Einar took Carl to the forest. He pointed to a mighty oak tree. "That is Uruz," he said. "Not the rune. The idea of the rune. The strength. The deep roots. The life. Feel it." They spent a whole season just observing. They watched the sun, Sowilo, rise and set. They felt the cold ice, Isa, on the pond in winter. They saw the joy of a good harvest, Jera. Einar taught Carl the names, the sounds, and the concepts associated with each rune. He taught him the poems, the kennings, the stories where the runes played a part. Carl had to learn the entire worldview that the runes described before he could even think about carving one. Only after a year did Einar give Carl a knife and a piece of wood. "Now," he said, "carve Thurisaz." Carl's hand trembled. He was not just carving a shape. He was trying to imbue the wood with the concept of a thorn, of a giant, of focused power. His first attempt was clumsy. "Again," Einar said. Carl carved it again. And again. For a week he carved nothing but Thurisaz. Einar taught him how the angle of the cut mattered, how the type of wood changed the feel. Birch was for beginnings. Oak was for strength. Yew was for matters of life and death. he learned that the sequence of runes mattered. You could not just write them in any order. Some runes strengthened each other, others canceled each other out. It was a form of chemistry, of grammar that was never written down. It was only spoken from master to apprentice. Carl never became a great Arelaz like Einar, but he learned the truth. The runes were not a simple code to be deciphered. They were a living tradition, a way of seeing and shaping the world. This knowledge could not be found in a book because it did not live on a page. It lived in the minds and hands of the people who practiced the craft. It was a secret you had to be shown. Number 13, some runes were deliberately hidden. Halfdan was a merchant, but in the year 850, that also meant he was a spy. He traveled on his ship from Birka in Sweden to Hedeby in Denmark, trading furs and amber. But he also carried messages for his Jarl, messages that could not fall into the wrong hands. If a rival Jarl captured his ship, a plainly written message would mean his death and a war. So Halfdan used secrets within secrets. He did not write his messages in plain runes. He used coded runes, ciphers that looked like nonsense to the untrained eye. These were not a single system. They were a collection of tricks and secret alphabets, known only to the sender and the intended recipient. One of the most common methods he used was known as branch runes or twig runes. The system was ingenious. The 24 runes of the Elder Futhark were divided into 3 groups, or a tier, of 8 runes each. The first 8 was Freya's AT, the second was Heimdall's, and the third was Tyr's. To write a rune in code, Halfdan would draw a vertical line. On the left side, he would carve a number of branches indicating the AET. 1 branch for the first AET, 2 for the second, 3 for the third. On the right side, he would carve branches to indicate the rune's position within that AET. So, to write the rune Uruz, which was the second rune of the first AET, he would carve a vertical stave with 1 branch on the left and 2 branches on the right. To write Hagalaz, the first rune of the second At, he would carve a stave with 2 branches on the left and 1 on the right. It was a simple substitution cipher, but to someone who did not know the order of the runes in the Futhark, and the system of counting, the resulting message was just a series of little lines branching off a central stem. It looked like a pattern, not writing. Halfdan had a message to send about a planned raid. The target was a port on the southern Baltic coast. The date was 3 weeks away. He took a small bone plate, the shoulder blade of a deer, and began to carve. He did not write out raid on Wolin in 3 weeks. He encoded it. The name Wolin became a series of forked sticks, and the numbers became a different kind of code, a tent rune cipher, where X shapes represented pairs of runes. The process was slow. He had to constantly check his key, a small memorized chart in his head. One mistake would make the whole message unreadable. But the security was worth it. 2 days out from Hedeby, his ship was stopped by a vessel belonging to a rival, Jarl Eric. And Eric's men searched Halfdan's ship. They were looking for messages. They found the bone plate. One of Eric's men, who could read runes, looked at it. He saw the strange branch-like carvings. "What is this?" he asked Halfdan. Halfdan shrugged. "Used a game I play to pass the time. A counting game." The man looked at it again. It did not look like any runes he knew. It seemed random. He showed it to his captain, who also dismissed it. It was meaningless doodling. They let Halfdan go. When Halfdan arrived in Hedeby, he delivered the bone plate to his Jarl's contact. The contact knew the key. He sat by a candle, carefully translating the branches and tents back into standard runes, and then into words. The message was received. The raid would be a surprise. The secret was that the runes had a public face and a private one. The memorial stones shouted their messages to the world, but in the shadows, on small pieces of wood and bone, coded runes whispered secrets. They were a tool for cryptography, a way to hide meaning in plain sight, proving that even in a world of warriors, the most powerful weapon could be a hidden message. Number 12. A single rune could be a whole prayer. Astrid was pregnant with her first child. It was the year 990 in the Icelandic highlands. The land was new to her people, a vast, empty place of volcanoes, glaciers, and wind. Life was fragile here. The winters were long and brutal. Many children did not survive their first one. Astrid was afraid. She wanted to protect her unborn child. She wanted to do something to ask for a safe birth and a healthy life. But she was not a rune master. She did not know how to carve a long, poetic charm. She knew the stories of powerful Galder, of complex spells woven with many runes. But that was not her way. Her faith was simpler, more direct. She knew the runes by name and by meaning, as most people did. She knew that some were for protection, some for life, some for strength, and she knew that sometimes one was enough. She went to the river and found a small, smooth, flat stone, a dark gray basalt that fit perfectly in the palm of her hand. She took it back to her small turf house. By the light of the fire, she took a sharp piece of flint. She did not need an iron knife. The intent was more important than the tool. She thought about what she wanted most. A healthy child, a new life, the continuation of her family. She thought of the rune that held that concept. It's Birkenau, the birch rune. It was the rune of birth, of new beginnings, of family, of nurturing. It looked like a capital B. She did not carve a sentence. She did not write, "Please let my child be healthy." She focused all her fear, all her hope, all her fierce maternal love into a single point. And she carved one rune onto the stone, Birkenau. As she scraped the flint against the basalt, she whispered the rune's name. Birkenau, she saw in her mind a birch tree in spring, covered in new leaves. She pictured a healthy baby in her arms. She poured all of that into the single shape. When she was done, she held the stone in her hand. It felt warm. It was no longer just a rock. It was a focal point, a prayer made solid. She did not stop there. She wanted to combine concepts. She wanted the protection of the family and the strength of a man. So she took another piece of wood, a small disc cut from a rowan branch. On it, she carved another single mark. But this one was a combination. She carved Othala, the rune of heritage, home, and ancestral land. It looked like a diamond on two legs. Then, directly on top of it, she carved Manaz, the rune of mankind, of humanity, of her husband. The two shapes merged, sharing lines, creating a new, single, complex symbol. This was a bind rune. It was not a word. It was an equation. Othala plus Manaz equals a protected family, a strong lineage. It was a compact, powerful statement of will, a logo for her hopes. She kept the Birkenau stone in a pouch around her neck. She hung the Othala Manaz bind rune over the door of her house. These were not decorations, they were active objects. Every time she touched the stone, she was reminded of her prayer, her focus. You know, every time she walked under the bind rune, she felt a sense of security. You know, the secret was in the compression. A single rune or a bind rune was a form of magical shorthand. It was a way for an ordinary person to access the power of the runic system without needing to be a master of its complex grammar. It was a whole prayer, a whole spell, a whole hope contained in a single potent shape. Number 11, they chanted the runes to make them work. The sea was a monster. It was the year 872, and Ragnar was on a longship halfway between Norway and the newly discovered lands of Iceland. A storm had come up from the north without warning. The sky was black. The waves were mountains of cold, green water that crashed over the deck, threatening to swamp the small vessel. The wind screamed in the rigging. Men were shouting, bailing, trying to hold the sail from tearing itself to pieces. They were losing. In the stern, holding the steering oar with a grip of iron, was the chieftain Orm. He was an old man, his beard white with salt spray, but his voice, when he used it, was like rocks grinding together. As the storm worsened and fear began to turn to despair in the eyes of his crew, Orm did something strange. He began to sing. It was not a sea shanty or a heroic song. It was a low, guttural chant, a Galder, and the words he chanted were the names of the runes. "Rado! Rado! Rado," he began, his voice a deep drone that seemed to cut through the howl of the wind. He was calling on the rune of the journey, not just for protection, but to impose order on the chaos of their voyage. He was trying to remind the journey that it had a purpose, a destination. Then his chant shifted. Laguz! 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 He sang the name of the rune for water, but he was not just naming it, he was trying to speak to it. His tone was not one of begging, it was a command, a negotiation. He was trying to reason with the sea itself, using the primal sound that was connected to it. The sound Laguz was a vibration, a frequency. A young man near him, his face white with fear and seasickness, shouted, "What are you doing, old man?" Pray to Thor. Orm did not even look at him. His eyes were fixed on the waves. His chant grew louder, more powerful. He combined the runes. Ewaz, Laguz, Ewaz, Laguz. He was binding the horse, Ewaz, the rune of movement and partnership, to the water, Laguz. He was trying to make the ship and the sea work together to turn the chaotic waves into a path they could ride. This was the secret of the Galder. Runes were not just visual symbols, they were phonetic. Each rune had a sound, and that sound had power. To carve a rune was to give it a body. To chant a rune was to give it a voice. To release its energy into the world as a vibration. The Norse people believed the universe was created from sound. The Eddas speak of Ginnungagap, the great void, where the energies of fire and ice met and created a vibration, a sound. That began the process of creation. Galder was a way to tap into that creative, formative power. Orm was not just singing words, he was trying to create a pattern of sound, an island of order in the sonic chaos of the storm. He was using his voice as a tool, just as a blacksmith uses a hammer. The vibrations from his throat were meant to resonate with the forces of nature, to influence them, to calm them. The storm did not magically stop. That is not how it worked. But something did change. The crew, hearing Orm's relentless, steady chant, found a new focus. Their panic subsided, they worked with more rhythm, more purpose. Orm's Galder was a rallying point, a human sound of pure will against the storm's mindless rage. They fought harder, they survived the worst of it. By dawn, the wind had lessened, the sea was still rough, but the ship was intact. They had made it. The young man looked at Orm, who was still at the helm, his face exhausted but his voice still a low hum. He had not just steered the ship with an oar, he had tried to steer reality with his voice. The chanting was not a prayer for help. It was the act of helping. Number 10, runes weren't just for Vikings in Scandinavia. His name was Tofi, and he was a long way from home. It was the year 1040, and he was standing not in a fjord in Norway, but in the bustling, chaotic, magnificent city of Constantinople. Miklagard, the Great City, as his people called it, he was a Varangian, one of the elite Norse mercenaries who served as the personal bodyguard for the Byzantine emperor. Tofi was bored. He was on guard duty in the upper gallery of the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom. He had stood there for hours. Below him, priests chanted in a language he did not understand, surrounded by glittering mosaics of saints and angels. It was impressive, but it was not his world. His eyes wandered over the marble railing of the gallery. It was smooth and pale, worn down by the hands of countless worshippers over centuries. He felt a pang of homesickness, a desire to leave his mark, to say, "I was here." He had his knife, he looked around, no one was watching him. He leaned against the balustrade, and with the tip of his blade, he began to scratch. He did not write in Greek or Latin. He wrote in the letters he knew, the runes of his homeland. He carved carefully into the marble. Halfdan carved these runes. He was not the first. Another Varangian had already carved a message nearby. Tofi added his own, a simple declarative statement. An act of minor vandalism that was also a profound statement of identity in a foreign land. This was a secret many forget. The runic alphabet was not confined to the farms and fjords of Scandinavia. It traveled. The Vikings were, above all, a people on the move, and they took their writing system with them. Runes have been found scratched into a marble lion in Venice, originally from Athens. They have been found in Russia and Ukraine along the river routes the Rus traders used. They have been found in Greenland on tools and gravestones from the short-lived Norse colonies, and they were all over the British Isles. In England, the Anglo-Saxons had adapted the runic system long before the Viking invasions. They created their own version, the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc, expanding it to as many as 33 letters to accommodate the sounds of Old English. They wrote poems in runes like the beautiful Dream of the Rood carved on the 8th century Ruthwell cross in Scotland. The Frank's casket, a whalebone box from Northumbria, is covered in a bewildering mix of runic inscriptions, Latin letters, and Christian and pagan imagery. The runes were a flexible, adaptable system. They were not a single monolithic alphabet. They were a family of related scripts that evolved and changed as the Germanic languages they recorded also evolved and changed. There were Gothic runes used by the tribes who would eventually sack Rome. There were the short twig runes of Sweden and Norway, a kind of runic shorthand. So when Tofi carved his name in the Hagia Sophia, he was part of a much larger story. He was a node in a vast network of runic literacy that stretched from the frozen shores of Greenland to the heart of the Byzantine Empire. The runes were an international script, the writing of a people who were remaking the map of the known world. His small act of graffiti, preserved for 1,000 years, is a testament to this fact. The runes were not an isolated, primitive alphabet. They were the traveling companions of explorers, traders, mercenaries, and kings. They were a piece of home that a man like Halfdan could carry with him all the way to the Golden Horn, a secret message left in the heart of a foreign empire. Number 9. They used runes to talk to the dead. The grave was a mound of earth and stone overlooking the fjord. It had been there for a year. Inside lay Astrid, mother of Sigurd. She had died in childbirth a common and terrible fate. Sigurd, her son, had survived. Now, on the first anniversary of her death, her husband Eirik came to the mount. He was not alone. He brought with him a rune master. Eric's grief was a raw, open wound. He missed his wife, but more than that, he felt a deep need to communicate with her, to ensure her spirit was at peace, and to tell her that their son was strong. In his worldview, death was not a final curtain. It was a change of address. The dead were still present, still aware, and could still be spoken to. The memorial stone was the medium for that conversation. The rune master, a man named Kettle, had already selected the stone. It was a tall, flat slab of gneiss, its surface covered in glittering flecks of mica. He had spent the morning dressing the stone, making its face smooth enough for carving. Now he spoke with Eric. What should it say? Kettle asked. This was not a simple question of choosing an epitaph. It was about crafting a message that would bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Tell her, Eric began, his voice thick with emotion. Tell her that I, Eric, raised this stone for her. Tell her she was the best of wives, and tell her that Sigurd lives. Kettle nodded. He took a piece of charcoal and began to sketch the layout on the stone. He drew a long, winding serpent, a common motif. The runes would be carved into the serpent's body. The serpent was a creature that lived between worlds, shedding its skin, a symbol of transition and eternity. The runes placed within it would be carried by its power. The inscription Kettle carved was more than just the words Eric had spoken. It was a formal communication. Erikr Risti Stindena Eptir Astridu Konasini Bezda Sigurdir Lafir. With each tap of the hammer on the chisel, Kettle was not just cutting stone. He was pushing the message through the veil between worlds. The memorial stone was not just about Astrid. It was for Astrid. It was a letter to the afterlife. When the carving was done, Kettle performed the final step. He colored the runes with red ochre, the color of blood and life, to give them a voice. As he did, he chanted the message aloud, his voice ringing in the cold air. He was reading the letter to its intended recipient. Eric stood watching, his heart aching. He believed that his wife's spirit, residing in the mound or in the halls of the afterlife, could now see and hear this message. The stone was a permanent beacon, a constant broadcast of his love and the news of their son. It ensured that she was not forgotten, which was crucial. To be forgotten was to fade away, to truly die a second time. This was the secret of the memorial stones that dot the Scandinavian landscape. They were not just historical records for the living, they were communication devices, they were a technology for maintaining connections with the dead. Each one is a letter, a final conversation, a promise not to forget, carved in stone and spoken to the wind. For Eric, the stone on the hill was a comfort. It was a way to keep talking to the woman he had lost. Number 8, the alphabet changed because the language did. Her name was Ulfhild, and she was a rune carver in training. The year was 820, and she lived in the region around Lake Mälaren in Sweden. Her teacher was an old man named Sten, who had learned the runes as a young boy, and this was the source of their constant arguments. Sten had learned the Elder Futhark, the old alphabet of 24 runes. It was the alphabet of the ancient stones, the one with a distinct symbol for every sound in the old Proto-Norse language. He carved it with a slow, heavy grace, but the language people actually spoke was changing fast. Sounds were dropping out. Vowels were shifting, words were getting shorter. The Old Norse that would become the language of the sagas was being born, and it was a leaner, quicker language than the one the Elder Futhark was designed for. Ulfhild knew this. She and her friends did not speak like Sten. They spoke the new tongue. And for this new tongue, a new alphabet was emerging the younger Futhark. It was a radical simplification. It had only 16 runes, not 24. It is lazy. Sten would grumble looking at Ulfhild's practice carvings. This new way is a mess. Your K rune is the same as your G rune. Your A rune is the same as your O rune. How can anyone read this nonsense? He was right. The younger Futhark was ambiguous. The rune kaun, which looked like a K, was now used for both the kaun sound and the kaun sound. The rune R, which looked like an R, was used for a variety of vowel sounds. You had to know the language well to understand which sound was intended. The context was everything. It is faster, old man, Ulfhild would retort. The old way has too many letters. It takes too long. This is how people speak now. The writing must follow the speech. This was the secret. The runic alphabet was not a sacred, unchanging gift from the gods. It was a living tool that adapted to the needs of its users. The shift from the 24-rune Elder Futhark to the 16-rune Younger Futhark around the 8th century was a massive revolutionary change. And it was driven not by scholars or kings, but by ordinary people. It was a matter of efficiency. Why have 2 different runes, fork and G, if the context makes it clear which one you mean? Why have separate runes for a no when the word itself tells you how to pronounce it? It was a streamlining, a response to a language that was itself becoming more streamlined. Ulfhild was carving a small wooden tag for a merchant. The merchant wanted it to say Gunnar a skip, or Gunnar owns the ship. Using Sten's old alphabet would have been complex. Using her new alphabet, she carved quickly. The word Gunnar started with the kaun rune. Anyone reading it would know from the name that it was a hard sound, not a kike sound. The word aons was just the R rune. The context made the meaning clear. It was quick, it was simple, it was good enough. The transition was not clean. For a time, both systems were used. Some carvers mixed them. The rock stone, carved around this time, famously uses both Elder and Younger Futhark runes. It was a period of linguistic and orthographic chaos, but eventually the new, efficient system won. Almost all inscriptions from the Viking Age proper are in Younger Futhark. The alphabet did not get simpler because people got dumber. It got simpler because the language changed and the writing system had to race to keep up. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. Ulfhild was not disrespecting the past. She was inventing the future. Number 7. Women were runic masters too. The chieftain was dying. A festering wound in his leg, a gift from an enemy's axe, had turned black. The healer had used all her herbs, all her poultices, nothing worked. The fever was rising. In desperation, the chieftain's wife sent for someone else. She did not send for another warrior or a male healer. She sent for a woman named Ragna. Ragna lived at the edge of the village in a small house filled with strange bundles of dried plants and polished stones. She was a Volva, a Cirrus, a woman who walked the path of Satyr, the powerful magic of the Norse world. And she was a master of the runes. The year was 930 in a settlement in central Denmark. When Ragna arrived, she did not look at the wound first. She looked at the man, she looked into his eyes, at the fear and the pain there. She was not just a healer of bodies. She was a healer of spirits. She asked for a bowl of clean water. She asked for 3 small strips of birch bark. She sat by the chieftain's bed, and the room fell silent. The men, the warriors, stood back. This was her space now. This was women's work, and it was more feared and respected than any work done with a sword. Ragna took out a small, sharp knife, its handle carved from the bone of a seabird. She closed her eyes, her lips moved, but she made no sound. She was listening. Not to the people in the room, but to the web of word, the threads of fate. She was seeking the right path, the right tool. Then her eyes opened. They were clear and focused. She knew what to do. On the first strip of bark, she carved a single rune Uruz, the rune of the Aurochs, primal strength, the will to live. On the second strip, she carved Suilo, the sun, wholeness, healing energy, the power that drives away darkness and disease. On the third, she carved Tiwaz, the rune of the sky god Tyr, the rune of victory, of justice, of a successful outcome in a struggle. She had not carved a plea, she had carved a battle plan, a set of instructions for the chieftain's body and spirit. Then she did what only a Volva would do. She took the 3 pieces of bark and dropped them into the bowl of water. She watched them as they floated, turning slowly. She began to chant a low, hypnotic song, the Galdor. And she sang the names of the runes, drawing out the sounds, making them vibrate in the still air of the sick room. She was not just reading the runes, she was activating them, using the water as a medium to carry their power. After a time, she took the Uruz bark from the water and placed it on the chieftain's chest. She put the Suilo bark on his forehead. And she took the Tiwaz bark and gently pressed it against the hewn wounded part of his thigh near the sickness. "Fight," she whispered to him. "The sun will aid you. Victory is yours to take." The role of women in runic practice is a secret often obscured by the saga's focus on male warriors. But the archaeological and mythological evidence is clear. Magic, especially the powerful satyr, was seen as a predominantly female art. The Volva was a figure of immense power, and the runes were one of her primary tools. Graves of high-status women have been found with runic wands and other ritual objects. Ragna was not an anomaly. She was a professional. Her knowledge of the runes was not a hobby. It was her craft, her calling. She was a spiritual technician, a weaver of fate, a master of a power that made even the strongest chieftain dependent on her skill. Whether the chieftain lived or died was now in the hands of fate. But Ragna had given him the weapons to fight his battle, and those weapons were 3 small marks, carved by a woman's hand. Number 6, everyday graffiti was runic. It was the winter of 1153. A group of Norsemen led by a man named Sigurd were a long, long way from home. They were on the Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland. A blizzard was raging outside. To escape it, they had broken into a great prehistoric tomb, a huge mound of earth and stone built by a forgotten people 4,000 years before their time. They called it Maesho. Inside it was dark, cold, and eerie. The tomb was a masterpiece of Stone Age engineering with a long passage leading to a central chamber. To pass the time, trapped by the storm, the Norsemen did what bored soldiers and travelers have done throughout history. They wrote on the walls. They did not have paint or charcoal. They had their axes and their knives. And the writing they used was the runes. One of them, a man with a sense of humor, carved into one of the massive stones of the chamber wall. These runes were carved by the man most skilled in runes in the Western Ocean. It was a boast, a bit of Viking swagger. Another wrote something more practical, thorny bedded, Helgi carved. A blunt, crude statement. A third carved a beautifully rendered dragon. Another carved a serpent knot. In all, they left over 30 runic inscriptions on the walls of that ancient tomb. They were not carving great memorials or magical spells. They were just writing. It was graffiti. Kilroy was here, Viking style. This is a secret that humanizes the Vikings. We think of runic inscriptions as serious monumental things, but much of the time they were casual. My show is the most spectacular example, but this runic graffiti is found all over the Viking world. In the old stave churches of Norway, people carved runes into the wooden walls during long, boring sermons. Inscriptions like "Arn is a fool" or "I was here on Saturday" have been found on the church pillars. In the city of Novgorod in Russia, where Swedish Vikings traded and settled, archaeologists have found hundreds of pieces of birch bark with runic messages. Many are business letters, but some are just doodles, practice alphabets, or insults. The carvers of the Meisho graffiti were not rune masters performing a sacred rite, or they were just men stuck in a storm with time on their hands and knives at their belts. They used the writing system they knew to leave their mark, to boast, to joke, to complain. One inscription in Meisho speaks of a great treasure that was supposedly hidden there long ago. It was a local legend. The carver writes about it, making it clear that he thinks it's a story, but an entertaining one. He is recording a piece of folklore, or perhaps a tall tale he heard in the local alehouse. These casual carvings show that runic literacy was widespread. It was not just for priests and chieftains. Ordinary sailors and warriors could read and write. They used runes for the same reasons we use writing today: to communicate, to record, to entertain, and to simply say, "I existed, I was in this place at this time." The great stones speak of jarls and kings. The graffiti on the wall of a tomb in Orkney gives us the voices of the common man. And that voice is often surprisingly modern, a little bit bored, and very human. Number 5, runes were used for boring paperwork. The fire was devastating. In the year 1198, a great blaze swept through the Briggen Wharf district of Bergen in Norway. The wooden buildings, warehouses, and homes were reduced to ash and charcoal. It was a catastrophe for the bustling port city. But for archaeologists 800 years later, it was a miracle. The fire baked the wet, boggy ground, and in the process it preserved thousands of wooden and bone objects that would have otherwise rotted away. And among the most important of these objects were over 600 small, unassuming pieces of wood and bone covered in runic inscriptions. These were the Bergen inscriptions, and they revealed a side of the runes that had been almost completely lost. They were not poems to Odin, they were not curses on enemies, they were, for the most part, paperwork. A historian named Eric was part of the team excavating the site in the 1950s. Day after day, he would find these small wooden sticks called runakefli and bone fragments. He would carefully clean the mud off them to reveal the tiny scratched runes, and he would read the daily, mundane, and sometimes very boring business of the 12th century. One stick was a simple order form. Einar sends his son this order for 3 barrels of herring. Another was a tag from a shipment of goods. This crate contains 100 whetstones. A third was a legal notice, a summons to court. A man named Thorir was being sued over a debt. The stick was the official document. Eric and his team realized they were looking at the lost world of everyday runic writing. Before paper became common, wood was the medium for all the small, temporary communications that a busy commercial town required. These were invoices, receipts, IOUs, and interoffice memos. One of the most famous inscriptions is a letter from a man named Halfgrim to his business partner, Vigleik. It is a mix of business and personal news. He complains about a deal that has gone bad. He asks for help. He sends greetings to Vigleik's wife. It is a perfectly normal letter, the kind of thing we would send in an email today. But it is carved in runes on a stick of wood. Some messages were even more personal. One poignant inscription reads, "Gaida says you are to go home." Was this a wife telling her husband to stop drinking at the tavern? A mother calling her son in for dinner? We will never know the full story, but it is a glimpse of a real human moment. This was the secret of the Bergen finds. They prove that runes were not just for the high and mighty or the magically inclined, they were a tool for everyone. A merchant used them to track his inventory. A housewife used them to write a shopping list. A shipper used them to label his cargo. This completely changed our understanding of literacy in the Viking Age and the medieval period that followed. It showed that reading and writing were not confined to a small class of scribes. Many ordinary people had a working knowledge of the runes because they needed them for their jobs and their daily lives. The runes were not just for stone and eternity, they were for wood and the day-to-day. They were a practical, functional script used for the most boring paperwork imaginable. And in their very ordinariness, they are extraordinary. Number 4, they told the future, but not like a crystal ball. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the year 98 AD, described a strange custom of the Germanic tribes. He wrote that they would cut a branch from a fruit-bearing tree, chop it into small pieces, and mark these pieces with certain signs. Then a priest would cast these pieces onto a white cloth and, looking to the heavens, would interpret the meaning of the chips as they had fallen. This is one of the earliest descriptions we have of rune casting. Fast forward 800 years, a woman named Freydis in a settlement in Iceland is facing a difficult choice. A ship is leaving for Greenland, her cousin is the captain, and he has offered her and her family passage. It is a chance for new land, a new life, but the journey is dangerous, the new colony is harsh, her farm in Iceland is not prosperous, but it is safe. Should she stay or should she go? She does not try to see the future like a fortune teller with a crystal ball. That is not how it works. She is not asking what will happen. She is asking, what are the forces at play here? What is the nature of the choice I am making? She is seeking wisdom, not a prediction. She has a small leather pouch. Inside are 16 small, flat pieces of yew wood. On each one, she has carved a rune of the younger Futhark. These are her tools for understanding. She goes to a quiet place by a stream. She spreads a piece of clean white linen on the ground, just as Tacitus described. She holds the pouch in her hands and closes her eyes. She does not think about Greenland or Iceland. She thinks about the choice itself, the path. She clears her mind of her own desires and fears. She wants to see the situation clearly. Then she opens the pouch and lets the wooden chips fall onto the cloth. They scatter in a random pattern. Some are face up, some face down. She only considers the ones that are face up. She does not try to read them all. Her eyes are drawn to 3 of them. The first is Rado, the rune for a journey. This is obvious. It represents the path to Greenland. It is the central question. To its left lies Thurisaz, the thorn, the giant. This represents the dangers, the challenges, the icebergs, the harsh winter, the struggle to build a new life. It is a warning. The path will not be easy. To the right lies Fihu, the rune of cattle, of wealth. This represents the potential reward. New land, a larger herd, prosperity for her children. It is the reason for taking the risk. Freydis looks at the 3 runes. The journey, the danger, the reward. They have not told her what to do. They have not predicted that the ship will sink or that she will become rich. They have simply laid out the nature of her choice in the clearest possible terms. The secret of rune casting was that it was a tool for diagnosis, not for divination. It was a way of using a set of symbols, each with a rich and complex meaning, to analyze a situation. The random fall of the runes was believed to reveal the hidden currents of fate, the underlying structure of a problem. It was a form of sacred psychology. It forced Freydis to look at her situation from a new perspective. She already knew about the dangers and the potential rewards, but seeing them laid out before her as primal forces, the thorn and the cattle, made her understand the choice on a deeper, more mythic level. She sits by the stream for a long time, looking at the 3 pieces of wood. The decision is still hers. The runes have not made it for her, they have only given her clarity. They have given her a map of the moment. Now she must choose which way to walk. Number 3, the same symbol could mean different things. It was the year 1050. Two rune carvers, an old master named Bjarni and his young apprentice Finn, were working on a memorial stone near the town of Sigtuna in Sweden. The inscription was for a woman named Ingrid, commissioned by her sons. Finn had carved the first line of runes. He was proud of his work. The lines were straight, the depths consistent. He called Bjarni over to inspect it. Bjarni looked at the runes, he squinted. He pointed with a thick finger to one of the symbols Finn had carved. It was a vertical line with a short diagonal branch going up to the right. It was the R rune from the younger Futhark. "What sound is this supposed to be?" Bjarni asked. "It's an A sound," Finn said, "for her name, Ingrid." As Bjarni shook his head, "In this word, boy, it is an O sound. And in the next word, you will use the same rune for a jaw sound. And last week, we used it for an A sound. Do you understand?" Finn was confused. "But it is one rune. How can it be so many different sounds?" "Because the alphabet is small and the language is large," Bjarni said gruffly. "Well, you do not carve the sound. You carve a suggestion of the sound. The person reading it must use their mind. They must know the language. The rune is a clue, not an answer." This was a critical and often misunderstood secret of the younger Futhark. With only 16 runes to represent all the sounds of Old Norse, many runes had to do double or even triple duty. The system was incredibly ambiguous. The Kaun rune, like a K, could be a K, or a job, or even the Isa rune, a vertical line, could be Ani or an E. The rune, an inverted U, could be UV doyororo. This made reading runes a bit like solving a puzzle. You had to rely heavily on context. When you saw your rune, you had to look at the letters around it and the structure of the word to know which of its 6 possible sounds was the right one. This is why, for centuries, scholars struggled to read runic inscriptions. They were trying to apply a simple one-to-one letter for sound logic, like with the Latin alphabet. But the runic system did not work that way. It required a deep, intuitive understanding of the Old Norse language. Bjarni tried to explain this to Finn. "Think of it like a footprint in the mud," he said. "Does the footprint tell you the name of the man who made it? No. But it tells you his direction. It tells you if he was running or walking. It gives you clues. You must use your own knowledge to find the man. A rune is a footprint of a sound." This ambiguity was not seen as a flaw. It was a feature. It made the system efficient to carve. You needed to learn fewer symbols. But it also meant that runic literacy was more than just knowing the alphabet. It was about having a deep familiarity with the spoken language. You could not sound out a runic word if you did not already have a good idea of what the word was supposed to be. The secret was that the runes were a kind of shorthand. They were a set of prompts for a knowledgeable reader. The meaning was not just in the marks on the stone, it was in the shared understanding between the carver and the reader. This is what made the system both incredibly efficient and, for outsiders, maddeningly opaque. Number 2, the end of the rune was not an end at all. Most people think the runes died out with the Vikings. They believe that when the Christian crosses replaced the hammer of Thor, the Latin alphabet of the church replaced the old Futhark. And for the most part, that is true. In the big cities, in the courts of kings, among the bishops and the clerks, Latin script took over. But in the quiet, isolated valleys of Sweden, the runes refused to die. Her name was Elin. The year was 1750. She lived in the province of Dalarna, a remote, fiercely independent region of Sweden. She was not a Viking. She was a farmer's wife, a devout Christian who went to church every Sunday, and she wrote in runes. If she was not using the old Futhark of the Viking Age, she was using a script called Dalecarlian runes. It was a hybrid system that had evolved over the centuries. The shapes of the letters were clearly runic, all straight lines and sharp angles, easy to carve into wood. But the alphabet itself had been modified. New runes had been invented for sounds that did not exist in Old Norse. Some runes had been borrowed from the Latin alphabet and given a runic angular form. Elin was writing a message for her neighbor. She was not carving on a memorial stone. She was using a knife to scratch a note onto a long, thin stick of wood, a message stick. The note said, "Bring 2 horses for the haymaking on Tuesday. When she was done, she would give the stick to her son, and he would run it over to the next farm." This was how they sent messages. It was faster and more reliable than trying to find a scrap of expensive paper and ink. This was the secret of the rune's survival. In places like Dalarna, far from the centers of power and education, the old ways persisted because they were practical. People were not using runes for magic or to honor ancient gods. They were using them because they were the best tool for the job. It was easy to carve a message on a piece of wood with a knife you carried every day. The local churches even accepted this. In some Dalarnan parishes, the priests kept records in runes. The names of farms, the dates of births and deaths were all recorded in this ancient script. The runes had been baptized. In Ellen's house, the family calendar was a huge wooden beam above the fireplace. It was a runic calendar, or clog almanac. It had special runes to mark the days of the week, the phases of the moon, and important holidays like Christmas and Midsummer. It was a system that had been passed down for generations. The runes had survived by becoming mundane. They had lost their connection to Odin and cider, but in doing so they had found a new way to be useful. They were no longer the script of warriors and mystics. They were the script of farmers and villagers. Scholars and officials from Stockholm would sometimes visit Dalarna and be astonished to find this living fossil. They would see people using a writing system they thought had been dead for 700 years. The last known use of Dalecarlian runes for everyday communication was in the early 20th century. Ellen's great-great-grandchildren might have been the last generation to use them. The end of the runes was not a sudden death. It was a long, slow fading, and in some forgotten corners of the world that fading took almost 1,000 years. The runes did not vanish with the last longship. They lingered in the quiet places, carved on a farmer's calendar, right up to the age of the steam engine and the telegraph. Number 1, the greatest runic secret is that we're still guessing. Her name is Dr. Aris Thorn. The year is 2023. She is not in a windswept fjord, but in a quiet university library, surrounded by books and digital scanners. She is a runologist, one of a small, dedicated group of scholars who spend their lives trying to understand these ancient marks. And if you ask her what the greatest secret of the runes is, she will tell you something simple we are still guessing. She is working on a small inscription found on a piece of bone from the 8th century. The runes are clear. The transcription is easy. It reads, Ek Erelaz, 3 words. But these 3 words are a battleground. Ek means I. That part is easy. Erelaz is the mystery. For decades, it was thought to be a tribal name, the Heruli. So the inscription meant I, the Herulian, a simple statement of origin. But new research suggests it might mean something else. It could be a title. It might mean Rune Master or Sorcerer. If so, the inscription changes dramatically. It becomes I the Rune Master, a proud declaration of a specific, powerful identity. Which one is it? Eris and her colleagues debate it endlessly. They write papers, they argue at conferences, they analyze every known use of the word. They do not have a final answer. This is the real heart of the matter. We have lost the user's manual. The people who carved the runes are gone, and they did not leave us a dictionary or a grammar book. Everything we know is a reconstruction, a piece of detective work based on a handful of clues. Eris looks up from the bone inscription and thinks of the Rokestone, the great monster of runology that Varin carved for his son back in the 9th century. After 150 years of intense study, we are still not sure what it is about. New theories emerge every decade. One scholar argues it is about a battle, another argues it is about a series of myths. A recent compelling theory suggests it is a complex magical text designed to ward off a climate catastrophe, a repeat of the volcanic winter of 536 AD. Who is right? Maybe none of them, maybe all of them. The text is so dense with kennings, poetic metaphors, and lost lore that it is like reading a single cryptic page from a 1,000-page book whose other 999 pages are lost. We do not know for certain how rune casting worked. Tacitus gives us one glimpse. The sagas give us others, but these are outside observations. We do not have a first-hand account from a runecaster explaining their methods. Modern systems of rune divination are modern reconstructions inspired by the past, but not a direct continuation of it. We do not know the full meaning of the Galder chants. We know they chanted the rune names, but we do not know the melodies, the rhythms, the specific rituals that went with them. The sound of the magic is lost, and we are left with only the silent text. The greatest secret of the runes is the sheer scale of what we have lost. For every inscription we have found, thousands have rotted away on wood or been lost. For every myth hinted at on a stone, entire libraries of oral tradition have vanished. Eris Thorn looks back at the inscription. Ek Erelaz, I am the rune master. It feels right, but feels right is not proof. All of her knowledge, all of the science and linguistics has brought her to this point a deep, profound humility. She is standing on the shore of a vast ocean of lost knowledge, and all she can do is pick up the few shells that have washed up and wonder at their shape. The runes guard their secrets well. And the final, most important secret is that they will never give them all up. They will always remain a little bit wild, a little bit mysterious, a testament to a world that we can almost, but not quite, understand. And for a scholar like Eris, that is what makes them endlessly fascinating. The mystery is the point. The guessing is the work. And the silence from the past is the loudest message of all.